All right, everyone. In this video, we're going to finish up with our lecture on emotion theory and then switch over into some quick slides on emotional expression. So we finished up on Friday with appraisal theory. Okay. And remember that in appraisal theory, the idea is that some appraisal or some assessment of a situation is what generates both a subjective reaction and a physiological reaction to some sort of stimuli. So again, here in this appraisal model, we see the bear, we have an appraisal of that bear, and then that appraisal, whatever appraisal we come up with, then results in a specific emotion and along with a physiological physiological response. Now, from appraisal theory, the main elements of this appraisal are: is this relevant to me? Can I cope with consequences? If we go through, depending on the answer to those questions, we then get a different type of emotion. So appraisal theory, very strong in that it's kind of intuitive. It probably accounts for a lot of the types of experiences that we have on a day-to-day basis. It fits well with a lot of the different types of psychotherapies, evidence-based psychotherapies that we use. And it accounts for why different people will have different reactions to different stimuli, different people will have different reactions to this same experience, even if everything else is the same. So again, if I'm out hunting for bears, then I might have a different reaction than if I'm not hunting for bears, right? Or we talked about in social situations, same social situation, you put two people in the same social situation, depending on what this appraisal looks like for one person versus the other, could get very different emotional reactions. Okay, so we talked about criticisms. A lot of these have to do with this appraisal piece and whether or not this is crucial or necessary for having an emotion. Appraisal theory says if we don't have this appraisal, this cognition, then emotion can't occur. But we know, as we talked about last time, that emotions are often experienced as instantaneous and unavoidable. If we assume that there's some sort of appraisal process, some volitional appraisal process, that kind of takes some time. Difficult to verbalize emotions, right? If we're thinking about emotions as being a reaction to a laid out plan or an assessment, a reasonable assessment of something, we would think that would be easier to walk people through, verbalize. And then we have evidence for emotion occurring without some sort of process here. And so while appraisal theory is a strong theory, it may not capture all types of emotion. Okay, and this is where we get into the last one, going to be Zientz's emotional cognitive independence model. Okay, remember with appraisal theory says that if I don't have some sort of assessment, I can't have an emotion. Zientz in the emotional cognitive independence model says that what we can have is emotional stimuli that trigger what's thought of in these models as some innate affective program. Okay, and by an affective program, what we're talking about is some hardwired emotional reaction, something that's innate, we're born with, and sometimes we go through and there are things out in the world that trigger these innate biological evolutionary affective programs. And then that's what then results in the emotion. So once that's triggered, it's like something goes through, flips the switch, and then the ball is rolling. Then everything after that just kind of comes together. So with Zientz's model, talking about affective programs, including both, again, like everything else we've talked about, some physiological and subjective components. But the key feature of Zientz's model is that these subjective and physiological response may or may not be experienced as a conscious emotion. And this is where we start to get into some important differences between Zientz and Lazarus, is that Zientz is starting to talk about some things in sort of a model of emotion that captures some things we see in research that are hard to explain with appraisal theory. So the idea is with the emotional cognitive independence model. I see the bear, and what that bear does is it throws the switch on a fear program in my system, right? And that fear program contains a subjective experience, it contains a physiological experience, but this is all hardwired into my system, okay? Now, science makes the argument that their model, this emotional cognitive independence model, is limited to basic emotions that are sort of evolutionarily adaptive, kind of the core stuff. They're saying emotion can involve cognition, it just doesn't have to. Okay, and so this starts to do a better job of starting to understand why we can see something that looks like an emotional reaction, even in situations where we've ruled out the possibility of some sort of reasoned appraisal of a situation. It does a better job of accounting for why these emotions are instantaneous, why they're hard to verbalize, and then in some situations where we would wonder what, at least from an appraisal standpoint says if we don't have an appraisal, we can't have an emotion, right? But as we talked about in Friday's class, what about young children? What about infants, right? They're clearly having an emotional reaction. To think that an infant is having some sort of an assessment of a situation may be off base, but even more technically nuanced is some emotion with some priming. Okay, now we had talked a lot about priming and talking about threshold of perception, and if I present something to you below the threshold of perception, you won't know. You might know that I showed you something if something flashed on the screen, but you might not. But you won't be able to tell me whatever that thing was, right? And so what we've seen is some very interesting research looking into this emotional cognitive independence model. If I pull you up and you're terrified of snakes, let's say, and I throw a picture of you can't even look at snakes. Looking at snakes throws your body into a tizzy, right? But what I could do is if I were to come through, bring you into the lab, hook you up with with a bunch of physiological sensors, and present you images of snakes below the threshold of perception, and presented to you sort of images of random objects, tables, chairs, bikes, something like that, again below the threshold of perception. And some of those images are going to be snakes, your feared stimulus. Some of those are going to be just random household items. What we might see is that even though you don't know or couldn't identify any of the images that as they come up, what we might find is that you're having greater physiological reactivity to the snake, images as to the household objects. And this is a hard thing for appraisal theory to account for, because you don't know what you saw. I presented it too fast for you. It was below the level of conscious awareness. But what we're still getting is something that looks like a physiological response, right? And again, that's a hard thing for appraisal theory to account for. And so emotional cognitive independence says that we have these innate programs. And when I flash a snake image on the screen, you can't tell me what you saw, but the idea is that stimulus would then very subtly start to trigger some of these emotions. Now, you're not going to freak out. You're not going to have a panic attack. You might not even be aware that you're responding more intensely to one set of images than another, but we're documenting your response. It is happening, right? And so this is where some of this cognitive independence model comes into play in terms of strengths. Okay. Now, criticisms, and these two, the Lazarus model and the Zients model, are the kind of the two big competing models right now. Lazarus and appraisal theorists would say that we're confusing cognitive with conscious processes, which is fine, but I don't like if we're saying that, the appraisal is really happening, you just can't see it or it's too fast and we can't measure it, then that's a problem for the theory, right? If we have something going on that we've proposed but we can't measure it, that's a problem. But Lazarus and appraisal theories will criticize Zients' model for their criticism that they say, a cognitive process might not be conscious with appraisal theory, and so that criticism is not fair of us. But so it's technically a criticism of Science's model and how they're sort of putting things together, but part of that back and forth. People will argue that Science's model are relevant to most emotional experience, which is probably fair for the most part, right? And 99% of our day-to-day experiences are going to be going through, we're encountering situations, we have some sort of assessment of that situation, and then have an emotional experience. But this emotional cognitive independence is hypothesizing a pathway that is relevant, that can happen, and so sort of something going on important there. And then this is probably the biggest one: dispute over the existence of innate affective programs. Central to emotional cognitive independence theory is that we have these innate, sort of hardwired emotional, for basic emotion, just these programs. A lot of dispute over what those look like, what evidence we have for that, where those tracks might be laid down in our system and things. So some questions there, but a strong model capturing some aspects of experience that we have good evidence for that aren't captured by the appraisal theory stuff. Yeah. So lecture summary, make sure that you go through, take a look at that. Comprehension check slides, make sure you're good there. And if you do that, you should be in pretty good shape. All right. Let's go through and jump into material on expressed emotion. Okay. Up to this point, the models that we've talked about have covered basically the stimulus, the physiological reaction, and this subjective experience in different configurations. But emotional expression is a big part of emotion as well, and something that's important for a lot of different reasons. And so we're going to go through, touch base on that stuff here. So when we're thinking about channels of emotional expression, different ways that we can go through and express emotion. Obviously, facial expressions are probably one of the biggest ones, right? Like, so that's generally what we see. But we also have things, body, that we would often talk about in terms of body language, your posture, right? If we look at this young woman right here, probably no questions about what she's feeling in terms of her internal emotional experience based on some of that posture piece of things, right? We also have how we go through and the inflection in our speech, right? I can say the same thing in many different ways, and depending on how I'm saying it, that could be, oh, that's very comforting, or maybe very, very scary, right? So the way we talk and so the inflection that we use also is a means of expressing emotion. Also, overt behavior, right? If I go through and I take a look and I just watch someone's behavior, can go through and make some assessments or guesses about their likely emotional experience. Now, this isn't 100%. Sometimes people behave in ways and we infer some sort of emotion that's associated with it, which could be wrong. But in general, facial expressions, posture, speech, behaviors would generally work together in sort of conveying information about emotion. All right. So when we're thinking about emotion, a couple different perspectives, but with this type of stuff, with the expression research, oftentimes we see people assuming what we would call a discrete perspective on emotion. Okay, this is different than dimensional models that we won't get into, but from a discrete perspective, the idea is that what we have as humans is a limited set of just primary, just basic innate emotions, okay? And the idea is that these primary emotions, these fundamental emotions, are neuropsychological phenomena, right? They're evolutionary, they're shaped by natural selection, that we have these basic emotion systems in. And so again, this is getting more similar to some stuff with like Science's model and James Lang types of things. This idea that we have a primary set of core emotions, and the idea being that these primary emotions are humanly universal, associated with recognizable expressions. Okay, so it doesn't matter where in the world I go. If I'm seeing anger in the U.S., if I'm seeing anger in Papua New Guinea, if I'm seeing anger in Japan, if I'm seeing anger in India, in Scandinavian countries, it all looks the same, okay, from this discrete emotion perspective. Now, depending on the theory, the number of primary emotions varies, depending on who you ask, but collection of some of these, just to give you a sense for what some of these primary emotions look like, things like anger, fear, joy, surprise, shame, disgust, interest. These are what we're talking about in terms of these core discrete emotion states. Okay. And so when we're thinking about a lot of models of emotional expression, tending to take this discrete perspective on, saying that what we have is some recognizable emotion or expressive behavior in response to these primary and universal emotional states. So when we're thinking about our adaptive functions of emotion, and we've talked about this previously with emotional experience, but also with expression, thinking about our ability to externally express an internal state in a way that's fairly universal and easy to recognize, thinking about this as a helpful thing. One, expression serving a social function, right? Again, think about if you were trying to be friends, and maybe you've had this experience with someone who does not express emotion, like any type of emotion, just very, very flat. It's hard to get a read on that person. It's hard to know how to respond. It's hard to know if they're joking or not joking. This expressive component starts to become very important for making sure that we're able to develop social bonds, communicate information to other people. Okay. And if we think about the types of information that expressive behavior is communicating to other people, it's telling us information about, obviously, if I'm expressing emotion, it tells information about me. What's my internal state, right? If I'm very clearly agitated and irritated and maybe angry, you're probably not going to come up and ask me for a favor right now, right? You're going to say, oh, Clap's in a mood. I'm going to just go ahead and leave him alone, right? Or if I'm, say, sad, and I'm clearly experiencing some negative emotion and you're my friend, maybe you come up and say, oh, this is communicating to me that Josh needs some help, that he needs some assistance, or at least asking for if he needs some help, right? So important information about whoever's doing the expressing. Also starts to provide us with information about objects, events in our social environment, right? So if I walk into a room and everybody around has a sad expression on their face, that communicates to me that something is going on sort of in the environment that alerts me and sort of helps guide my behavior. Or I'm walking sort of down the street and I see you coming the other way with a terrified look on your face, I'm probably going to go turn around and follow you because whatever's going on the other side is no good, right? So expressing to the group or groups of individuals also things that are going on in the environment. And also, finally, thinking about if you are in a relationship or have ever been in a relationship, romantic relationship or a relationship with sort of parents or family members or friends, things like that. We come in and our expressions communicate to other people sort of our assessment of this, of the relationship, how things are going, lots of information going on here. Again, think about what our communities, what our society, what life would look like if no one expressed any emotion. Would be very, very difficult to cohese together as groups and form relationships and things. Okay. These are the things that expression is important for, right? These are the functions of expression. But how we go through and skillfully express the types of expression, sort of how we time this all of this is sort of very, very important. The nuances start to become important for a good, positive, skillful interaction. And this is where things start to get difficult, right? If we're working with groups of individuals who sometimes struggle reading emotions or displaying proper emotion, right? Thinking about some core deficits in terms of autism spectrum disorder is difficulty reading emotions that are sort of fairly apparent to other people, and displaying emotions that are congruent with the situation. We have social skills training groups and things like that, and programs that can help try and teach this. But really, this is sort of nuance that you've picked up over your entire existence. How to express, when to express, how intense to express, right? Like, this all starts to become important for good interactions. And if we lose that, things start to break down very quickly, right? Again, think about if you were telling, say, a friend a bad story or a sad story, and they laughed or smiled and nodded their head, or you told them something exciting and they expressed anger, right? Like, or didn't express anything at all when they were supposed to express it, right? Like, all of these things, it's not hard to go through and start to disrupt by starting to play around with these sort of unspoken rules of expression. So, again, we talked about from a research standpoint the argument that expression is a universal human experience, right? And when we go through and we take a look at the research, it looks like this is true. Some areas where we go through and see this cross-cultural research. Here, we've got different expressions from people from all over the world. But if I go through and I take a look at this, I can probably tell exactly what each one of these individuals are experiencing, even though completely different cultures. And even if we get into here, early research looking at some tribes in Papua New Guinea with very, very limited interaction with Western society, Western individuals. And what you see is you go through and you have them express different emotions. I have no problem going through and I sort of getting a general read on what this individual is experiencing, right? And so when we look at how individuals express anger, sadness, joy, excitement, surprise, it's universal. It's the same across all different cultures, suggesting that sort of could be some kind of hardwired, there's likely some hardwired component to this. Okay? We also see evidence in neonatal or sort of young infant expression. Okay, if a baby's surprised, you see it's surprised. If it's sad, you see it's sad. Babies with no experience in the universe come out expressing emotion the same way we all express emotion, right? It doesn't look like they're learning it or picking it up. It's coming out right off the bat. And then again, if we look at individuals who have suffered from visual impairment for their entire lives, right? Still expressing the same type of emotion, right? Like, people who are visually impaired don't smile different or frown different than anybody else. Again, speaking to this kind of reflexive, automatic type or sort of hardwired programs that seem to control expression, that once again are universal, that aren't dependent on learning or sort of culture or things along those lines. Now, the display rules, like the extent to which people display emotion, now that will vary, right? But the hardwired actual expression looks pretty consistent across groups. And we can get into the musculature, right? If again we go through and we look at just human beings' musculature in their face, we appear to have muscles in our face that were sort of, the primary purpose of these appears to be to convey emotion and expression and things along these lines, okay? And again, if I'm talking about this from an evolutionary psychology standpoint or an adaptive standpoint, if we have muscles that are developed primarily to express internal states to other people, looking at this as additional evidence of expression as being fairly universal, right? So some basic muscles going on to be aware of. The zygomaticus major here in your cheeks, and the orbicularis oculi here around your eyes. These are two muscle groups in your face that are associated with smiling, right? If I ask you to tense your zygomaticus and your orbicularis, what it's going to do is it's going to produce a smile, right? Here we see with that orbicularis, right, the eyes, we see when we smile, we kind of get squinty eyes. I get squinty eyes if I smile. Sort of the zygomaticus pulling our cheeks back into this smile, okay? And again, different people from different parts of the world don't have different musculature. Again, this is a universal thing that's going on that's associated with a smile. Okay. We also have corrugator. Okay. Corrugator's up here. Corrugator is that brow furrow, right? If you go through and I ask you to flex your corrugator muscle, what it's going to do is it's going to bring your eyebrows together. Universal sign for a frown. Okay. And again, that's going to be right here. And again, pulling those eyebrows together. We do that. We're going to get something that starts to look a lot more like a negative emotion. Last one is your frontalis. Frontalis is your forehead muscles, right? If I ask you to raise or flex your frontalis, frontalis is going to bring your eyes open. It's going to bring your eyes open wide. This is going to be an expression or involved in fear, surprise, things like that, okay? So there are other fine muscles, and for different types of coding schemes and sort of evaluating emotion, there are some pretty intense stuff that looks specifically at the movement of some of these muscles and then some additional ones. But again, just seeing that the musculature of our face seems to be universally configured to convey the same types of emotion based on different tensions and flexing that are then recognized across cultures and across the world. Okay, so depending on what expression you're doing, sort of zygomatic or sort of what muscles here that you're flexing, identifying recognizable emotions. So bonus points here, or excuse me. Again, we're talking about this as this muscle looking primarily to be functioning in terms of expressive behavior. This looks to be consistent across individuals. But sometimes we get into emotions that are difficult to read. This looks like to be a mix of confusion and surprise. I don't know what that one is. You tell me what that one is. All right, cool. Other thing we want to talk about, so if we're talking about emotion expression as universal and something that is communicating things to other people, important to recognize that we also need to modulate our expression. Sometimes we need to tone it down. Sometimes we need to express or display an emotion that maybe we're not feeling, or inhibit an emotion that we are feeling but isn't socially acceptable to communicate at that point in time. Okay, and so this whole area of how we modulate our expression starts to become important. But the extent to which we're able to upregulate and downregulate our emotion starts to become complicated, right? This is a complex thing that some people do better than other people, right? We can take a look at research on authentic versus manufactured smiles. Think about this. If someone's smiling just to smile, or someone's smiling because they're authentically happy, we're, as human beings, very good at teasing this apart, right? If I show you these two pictures, right, to a person, all of you can identify which one of these is the real smile and which one is a manufactured smile, right? One is my picture smile. The other one is like a spontaneous eruption of sort of positive emotion, right? Very, very good at detecting these. And it's very, very hard to fake this, right? And so again, talking about how complex it is even to mimic emotions that we've been experiencing all of our lives in an authentic way. So again, speaking to the complexity here, we also see that when we're trying to downregulate an expression, it's often not, we're not able to just shut on or shut off the expression of emotion in many situations. Sometimes, and again, think about this, when you were disappointed and trying not to look disappointed, but still whoever you're talking about was saying, "Are you okay? What's the matter?" Right? I wasn't able to completely downregulate that. Or maybe someone told me something, and I thought it was funny, and I know it shouldn't be funny, but I'm trying to inhibit that expression. A lot of that can leak through. So even when we see, when we're trying to sort of manipulate our expressive behavior, there's true emotion leaking through a lot of times, and so it starts to become very difficult. Okay. And also we talk about, and again, before thinking about the timing and extent of expressive behavior, right? Even though emotion is a universal thing and the expression looks to be very, very universal, the display rules of my specific culture start to regulate when I'm able to express or what types of emotion I'm able to express. In some cultures, thinking about I guess research looking at the expression of emotion in Latin American countries. Now, obviously, sort of different cultural rules depending on where you're at regionally, but generally thought of as being more acceptable to display sort of a variety of emotional responses versus in some Eastern cultures, they say Japan, very, very strict norms on, particularly in formal social situations, what type of emotions are acceptable to express, which ones aren't. And so even though we're all experiencing the same emotions, right, and the expression of that emotion is going to be identical across groups, our culture determining what type of emotions are okay to express in social situations. And again, that's going to get into display rule stuff. Okay. All right. Going to finish up with some individual differences. So even though, again, we're talking about something that's universal, we see individual differences in sort of individuals' ability to detect and interpret emotional response. Again, if you think about people who you know, and maybe even yourself, we have some people in our orbits who are very good at picking up and detecting emotions and interpreting emotions back. Hey, what was wrong with that person back? I don't know. I didn't see anything. They're like, no, that person was definitely sad or happy. So this starts to get into what Gardner had called interpersonal intelligence. Again, not a lot of support for Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, but like this idea of emotional intelligence, interpersonal intelligence being a real thing. We see that some people are better at detecting and interpreting emotion than others. Okay. And what we see in terms of the research on this, pretty consistent gender or sex differences in terms of the detection and interpretation of emotion across men and women. Women tend to be better at detecting subtle emotional cues. If I present pictures of couples, and some of those couples are real couples who are expressing affection, and we have some just staged couples who are pretending to be couples, women tend to be much better at men at identifying the difference between the two. Women also tend, at least in Western society, show greater openness to emotional experience, and also some evidence of increased physiological reaction to expressed emotion. So if I lined all of you up or brought all of you into the lab and hooked you up with some physiological stuff, what we would guess we would see is that if I had someone in and expressing emotion and happiness, sadness, things along those lines, we would, on average, expect women to show greater physiological response to that expressed emotion than might men. Again, we don't know exactly why this happens, but again, something that looks to be a fairly robust finding, suggesting, again, pointing to individual differences across people in terms of the extent of their reaction, their ability to perceive and identify emotion. Okay. But what we do see is that people who are maybe a little bit more in tune and open to being able to detect and are maybe more sensitive to emotion in themselves and others, also looking to be at elevated risk for some anxiety and mood-related difficulties. And so, which kind of makes some sense, right? If I'm walking about oblivious to sort of other people and just assuming everything's fine all the time, then maybe I'm less stress and anxiety on my day than if I'm very much in tune with the emotional states of my friends, neighbors, community, things along those lines. And so we do see, while a very impressive ability to go through and detect some evidence of increased risk for mood and anxiety related difficulties for people who look to be a little bit more in tune with some of this stuff. All right. That's it. Again, said this was going to be short, but go through, make sure that you go through, take a look at the lecture summary, comprehension check slides. Do that. You should be good to go. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you Wednesday. All right.